The park was quiet, almost unnaturally so, as if the world had paused just to watch him. The late afternoon sun filtered through skeletal branches, casting long, trembling shadows across the worn wooden bench. He sat there alone, a sharp crease in his expensive suit betraying a life that was polished on the surface but hollow underneath. Every flicker of movement, a dog passing, a distant laugh, the rustle of leaves, made him flinch, a man unused to being unseen yet desperate to vanish. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and forgotten autumn, mingling with the faint perfume of a nearby flower bed, too delicate to mask the unease pressing against his chest. Somewhere in the distance, a ball bounced, the sound startling in its suddenness, echoing against the emptiness of the park. Shadows lengthened, hiding the shapes of the trees, bending reality into something uncertain, something waiting. And then a small hand touched his arm. Not roughly, not demanding, but softly, almost like a secret. He froze, tension crawling up his spine, the silence now thick and heavy. He didn't look. "Don't cry, miss," came a voice, impossibly tiny, yet piercing through the stillness. "You can borrow my dad." The park stretched out like a quiet, forgotten corner of the city, its winding paths lined with brittle autumn leaves that rustled underfoot even when no one was near. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp soil and the faint, metallic tang of early evening dew. It was the kind of place people passed through without noticing, yet for him it had become a refuge, though not one of comfort. The man on the bench had grown accustomed to the solitude, the empty spaces around him offering a strange, hollow solace that only heightened the hollowness inside. The world had always demanded of him power, precision, perfection. But here, in this quiet, abandoned corner, there was nothing but his own heartbeat, loud and unrelenting. He had arrived early, before the park had filled with children chasing errant balls or elderly couples tracing their habitual loops. The silence pressed against him like a second skin, both protective and suffocating. Every shadow seemed to flicker with intent, every gust of wind carrying whispers he wasn't meant to hear. Even the trees, bare and skeletal, seemed to lean toward him, their branches stretching like thin, accusing fingers. Here, in this unusual emptiness, he could feel the weight of his own life, the failures hidden behind the polished veneer of boardrooms and skyscrapers, the relentless solitude that money and success could never touch. Across the park, a cluster of small houses framed the horizon, their windows glowing faintly as families settled in for the evening. These houses were more than architecture. They were symbols of lives that moved forward in quiet, rhythmic harmony, lives in which loneliness had no foothold. He had walked past them countless times, never daring to step inside, never daring to imagine what warmth felt like. The contrast gnawed at him quietly, a slow burning ache that only deepened the more he observed it. Nearby, a playground lay dormant, its swings swaying slightly in the wind, chains creaking softly like whispered secrets. It was a place meant for laughter, for chaos, for life, yet at this moment it was still, a monument to absence. And from that stillness she appeared. A little girl no more than 7, with tangled hair and shoes too big for her small, hesitant steps. Her eyes were wide, serious, carrying an understanding far beyond her years, and she moved with the quiet assurance of someone accustomed to navigating worlds adults ignored. The girl's presence was abrupt, yet it somehow fit into the silence, threading herself into the space like a note in a forgotten song. She observed him carefully, tilting her head, her gaze scanning every line etched into his face, every twitch of tension in his hands. He was unaware, absorbed in the rhythm of his own thoughts, the weight of unshed grief pressing on his chest. It was only when her small hand brushed his sleeve that he registered she was there. The touch was gentle, innocent, yet it carried an almost unbearable clarity, a reminder that life could intrude even in places carefully chosen for solitude. She did not speak immediately, choosing instead to stand near the bench, her posture tense, ready. She seemed aware of boundaries unspoken yet rigid, aware of the fragility that hung about him like a fog. Her eyes lingered on his, searching, weighing, discerning. She seemed to know instinctively the invisible scars that ran beneath his calm exterior, the battles fought in silent boardrooms, the nights spent staring at ceilings, questioning every choice, every failure. There was empathy there, raw and startling, coming from a child who had no reason to care about the burdens of a man she had never known. Around them, the world continued in muted rhythms. A distant dog barked, breaking the quiet for a heartbeat before the sound dissolved into the wind. The trees groaned under their own weight, and the sun dropped lower, bathing the park in a melancholy amber glow. Each moment stretched longer than it should have, thickening the air with anticipation, the promise of something unspoken waiting to unfold. He remained still, pretending to read an invisible newspaper of his own making, though he knew the stillness would not last. Something about her presence demanded attention, a pull he could not resist, though he did not yet understand why. His life outside this park was meticulously constructed. Office lights that burned late into the night, meetings where smiles were masks and agreements were battlegrounds, dinners where conversation never ventured beyond surface pleasantries. Here, however, none of that mattered. Here there were no expectations, no strategies, no masks. The weight of his uniform life. The CEO, the husband, the absentee father, the man everyone thought they knew, felt suddenly fragile. The girl had not yet spoken, and already her presence was a mirror reflecting what he had carefully hidden for years. She moved slightly closer, shifting the balance of space, and in that movement a subtle tension began to coil around him. It was not fear exactly, but awareness, a recognition that her purpose, whatever it was, carried weight. The innocence she exuded was paired with a deliberate intelligence, a sense that she understood dynamics far beyond her age. There was no malice, yet the implication of her touch, her gaze, her mere proximity, unsettled him in ways he could not name. It forced him to consider the fragility of his own life, the vulnerabilities that his money and status could not shield. The park itself seemed to respond to this unspoken tension. Leaves skittered across the path in tiny eddies, as if stirred by invisible hands. Shadows deepened and stretched unnaturally in the fading light, curling around tree trunks and benches, creating pockets of uncertainty. The air grew cooler, carrying with it faint, almost imperceptible hints of distant city noise. A siren, the faint honk of a horn, a child's laughter from blocks away. Each sound punctuated the silence around them, magnifying the awareness of shared isolation. He was not alone, not truly, and yet the intrusion of her presence felt profound, unsettling, and urgent. In that quiet, suspended space, his life and hers converged in a single, invisible thread. She had come from somewhere he could not see, had arrived silently, and yet her purpose was unmistakable. She was small, fragile, a child in the literal sense, Yet her awareness of him, of the cracks in his armor, of the spaces he had long abandoned, was disarming. Something unspoken hovered in the air, something that promised revelation, confrontation, and perhaps salvation. And still, she did not speak. She waited. The wind teased her hair, the shadows twisted across the park's empty paths, and he remained uncertain, frozen, caught in a moment that felt larger than life. Within this stretch of time, stretched thin by anticipation, he sensed that what was about to happen would ripple far beyond this evening, beyond the park, beyond anything he had prepared himself for. Something had begun, something delicate yet unavoidable, a collision of two lonely souls on the verge of revelation. The little girl's gaze did not waver. She observed, calculated, and waited. And in that silent observation, he felt the first stirrings of emotion he had not allowed himself in years. There was a curiosity, sharp and insistent, a pull that demanded attention, a recognition that life, complicated, fragile, relentless life, was about to intrude upon the carefully maintained fortress of his isolation. It was then, as shadows thickened and the sun's final warmth faded, that the first words left her lips, small, unassuming, yet weighted with something he could not yet define. A phrase so simple it almost dissolved into the surrounding silence, yet so jarring it fractured the calm he had spent decades cultivating. It was a promise, a challenge, and a question all at once. It was the first thread in a web that would ensnare both their lives, a thread that held pain, hope, and unimaginable transformation. The little girl's words lingered in the air, heavier than the fading sunlight that filtered through the skeletal branches. He had expected solitude, perhaps even clarity, yet now the quiet had transformed into a strange, almost unbearable anticipation. The park, once a sanctuary, now felt like a stage set for something larger than either of them, a place where invisible forces pressed in from every angle. Shadows curled along the benches, the swings groaned faintly with the weight of unseen occupants, and every rustle of leaves carried with it a promise of revelation. He shifted slightly, unsure whether to rise and retreat or to stay and face the strange intrusion of this small, unassuming observer. She remained at his side, unwavering. Her presence was not chaotic but deliberate, as though she had chosen this moment to insert herself into a life carefully compartmentalized, a life designed to avoid mess, disorder, and vulnerability. There was intelligence in her silence, awareness that transcended her years. Every measured step, every tilt of her head suggested she was assessing him, weighing him, and perhaps even judging him. In that appraisal, he felt the first stirrings of unease, an emotional prickling that whispered of truths long buried, of things he had refused to face. His life had been built on control, precision, and distance. Boardrooms where decisions were made like chess moves, relationships maintained as strategic alliances, friendships that were contracts rather than bonds. All of it had demanded vigilance and restraint. Yet here, in the dimming light of the park, none of that armor mattered. The rules of the world outside dissolved, leaving him raw, exposed, and unprepared. He realized with a creeping dread that she could see the fractures even where he had carefully concealed them. The loneliness he carried like a second skin was now a visible mark, a map of wounds and regrets. The little girl moved slightly closer, her small shoes crunching against the fallen leaves, the sound stark against the stillness. Her eyes, dark and reflective, seemed to pierce through the polished veneer of his life. There was no mockery, no pity, only recognition. He could feel it deep in his chest, a tug of both fear and curiosity. The quiet was no longer comforting, it was a pressure, a suffocating weight that demanded acknowledgement. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet an equally insistent pull kept him rooted, forcing him to confront the unexpected. In the days that followed, the pattern of the park visits grew. He found himself returning, drawn to the same bench, the same shadows, as though some unseen force had tethered him there. The little girl would appear, always at the edge of perception, sometimes nearer, sometimes observing from a distance. And each time her presence left a residue, a mixture of confusion, guilt, and longing that clung to him throughout the day. He began to notice the small, telling details, the way her gaze lingered on the empty spaces of his life, the precision of her movements, the subtle shifts in her expression that suggested knowledge beyond her years. Outside the park, his world was different but no less fraught. The office demanded him with relentless intensity. Meetings, negotiations, and high-stakes decisions occupied his days, yet none of it alleviated the gnawing unease that had begun to infiltrate his thoughts. He felt a constant pull toward the park, an invisible tether linking him to the small figure who had disrupted the careful monotony of his existence. Every interaction with colleagues became strained. The quiet corners of boardrooms seemed suddenly suffocating. In his solitude, he wrestled with the absurdity of it all. A grown man, seasoned in power and authority, undone by the silent insistence of a child. The little girl, however, was not merely an observer. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she became an agent of disruption, threading herself into the fabric of his emotional world. She began leaving traces of her presence, a carefully folded leaf on his bench, the faint impression of a small hand in the dew on his coffee cup, subtle reminders that he was not alone. These gestures were innocent yet intimate, playful yet unsettling, each one forcing him to confront feelings he had long denied. Helplessness, an emotion he had meticulously avoided, began to creep in, mingling with guilt and the faint stirrings of hope. He began to notice the world differently. The park, once a backdrop of neutral silence, now became a stage of layered complexity. Shadows seemed to twist with intention, leaves whispered secrets, and the distant sounds of the city carried meanings he could no longer ignore. He observed families, couples, and children with a keen awareness, noting every interaction, every fleeting expression. In her presence, the stark contrast between his loneliness and the lives of others became undeniable. The little girl had forced a mirror into his solitude, reflecting not only what he lacked but also what he had forsaken. It was during one particular evening that the first hint of danger emerged, not external but internal. A man appeared on the opposite side of the park, his presence deliberate, watching, evaluating. His features were indistinct at first, obscured by the shadows, yet there was an unmistakable air of control, of authority, that immediately triggered a defensive tension in the CEO. He sensed the potential for intrusion, the possibility that his fragile equilibrium was being tested. The little girl, however, remained calm, standing beside him as though aware of forces he could not yet see. Her silence, once benign, now carried weight, a tacit acknowledgement that he was under scrutiny and that the world beyond the park had begun to seep in. The dynamic between them shifted subtly but irrevocably. The CEO's self-doubt intensified. Questions he had long buried resurfaced. Had he failed where it mattered most? Could he repair what had been neglected? And why did a child, a stranger, seem to hold the key to answers he could not find within himself? The tension was compounded by her inexplicable knowledge, the way she navigated the space with certainty, the way her gaze could pierce through layers of pretense. He felt watched, judged, yet strangely guided, a dichotomy that left him both anxious and intrigued. Secrets began to surface, both hers and his. He noticed small anomalies in the park, a missing toy from a nearby playground, a fleeting glimpse of a woman who seemed to know her movements, a pattern in the leaves that suggested intent. His mind, trained to detect patterns in business, now unraveled in the face of uncertainty, anxiety, and subtle threat. Each day in the park became a test, a delicate balancing act between awareness and surrender. He felt the grip of anticipation tighten with each visit, the slow burn of fear mixed with curiosity forming an unrelenting cadence. Simultaneously, personal vulnerabilities emerged in stark relief. He could no longer hide from the truth of his own isolation. Nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if connections could ever be genuine, became unavoidable memories. He began recalling relationships that had failed, moments when he had chosen ambition over empathy, success over intimacy. The little girl, with her uncanny awareness, served as a catalyst, bringing these buried reflections to the surface. Each visit to the park became a confrontation not with the world, but with himself, a confrontation he had long evaded. The atmosphere of suspense thickened with every passing encounter. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, clouds drifted across the sun with deliberate slowness, and the sounds of the park, the rustle of leaves, distant laughter, the creak of swings, were no longer background noise but harbingers of imminent revelation. He began noticing patterns in the little girl's behavior, the timing of her appearances, the subtle gestures that seemed to communicate more than words ever could. She had become an enigma, a presence that challenged his perception of reality, compelling him to observe, to analyze, to anticipate. As the days turned into weeks, a psychological tension built that was almost unbearable. He felt trapped between fear and hope, isolation and connection, control and surrender. The park became a crucible, a testing ground where his vulnerabilities were exposed and magnified. He began to see the world differently. Every glance, every gesture, every silence carried weight, meaning, and consequence. The little girl's presence was both a comfort and a threat, a reminder of the fragility of human connection and the potential for emotional rupture. The subtle power dynamics between them became apparent. Though she was a child, she held influence over him, shaping his emotional responses, guiding his reflections, and challenging his preconceptions. He realized that his solitude, once self-imposed, had been a prison, and she held the key to unlocking it. Yet with that realization came unease. If she could penetrate his defenses, what else could? What other truths, long buried and carefully concealed, were at risk of exposure? The park had transformed from a place of escape to a place of reckoning, and he was caught in the tension, powerless yet compelled to participate. The rising action reached a crescendo when a sudden event shattered the fragile equilibrium. A dog, loose from its owner, barreled through the park, scattering leaves and sending a flock of birds into flight. The sudden chaos mirrored the internal tumult he felt, the unpredictability of life, the fragility of control, and the looming presence of consequences. The little girl remained composed, guiding him through the disruption with a calmness that highlighted his own vulnerability. In that moment, the delicate thread connecting them snapped into focus. He was no longer merely an observer of his own life, but a participant in a story unfolding with relentless intensity. By now, the tension was palpable. He could no longer deny the emotional stakes, the psychological weight of her presence, or the sense of imminent revelation. Secrets waited in the shadows, truths lingered unspoken, and both their lives were poised on the edge of discovery. Every rustle of leaves, every shift in light, every distant sound carried significance, building toward a confrontation he could neither predict nor avoid. The park had become a labyrinth of emotional complexity, and he was trapped within it, forced to navigate paths of fear, guilt, hope, and fragile connection. The little girl's gaze, unwavering and intelligent, hinted at knowledge beyond her years. She was both guide and provocateur, leading him through a maze of reflection and suspense. And in that quiet, charged atmosphere, the stage was set for what would inevitably follow. A revelation, a betrayal, or a moment of clarity that would change everything. The evening air had thickened, carrying the weight of unsaid truths and unseen eyes. Shadows clung to the edges of the park like ink spilling over a page, stretching and twisting around every bench and tree. He sat rigid, every muscle coiled, sensing the inevitable rupture of the fragile equilibrium he had clung to for weeks. The little girl stood a few feet away, her small silhouette etched sharply against the deepening twilight. The serenity of her posture belied the storm gathering between them, a storm of unspoken history, hidden motives, and fragile emotions teetering on the edge of revelation. A sudden gust of wind swept across the park, rattling the leaves and sending a shiver through the man's spine. It was as though the world itself exhaled, signaling the arrival of truth. He realized with a jolt that the calm he had mistaken for safety was nothing but a prelude, the lull before the crescendo. Every instinct screamed caution, yet every cell in his body was drawn forward, magnetized by an urgency he could neither explain nor resist. She did not move, did not signal, did not waver. And yet the tension she carried was a palpable force, pressing against his chest, demanding confrontation. The revelation came first as a subtle shift in her expression, a tightening of the jaw, a sharpening of the gaze. It was a small, almost imperceptible signal, but in it lay the full weight of her purpose. He sensed the layers peeling away, memories and truths sliding into view like pieces of a puzzle long hidden in shadow. He had tried to shield himself, compartmentalize his life, and erect walls around the parts of himself he deemed weak. But here, under the growing darkness, the little girl became both witness and catalyst. His defenses, honed over decades of meticulous control, began to crumble, leaving raw vulnerability exposed in the open. He recalled the first day she had appeared, that tiny hand brushing against his sleeve, the words that had shattered his carefully maintained solitude. "Don't cry, miss, you can borrow my dad." The phrase, so simple, had seemed absurd at the time, almost comical, yet now it resonated with unbearable intensity. It was not a joke. It was a mirror, a challenge, and a key. It cut through layers of denial, forcing him to confront the loneliness he had normalized, the failures he had meticulously hidden, the gaps in his life that no achievement could ever fill. The park around them seemed to contract, compressing time and space until every sound, the distant hum of traffic, the rustle of leaves, the faint creak of swings, became amplified, urgent, meaningful. The shadows no longer merely danced, they whispered. The trees, skeletal and stoic, bent toward them as if compelled by some unseen gravity, framing the encounter with an intensity that bordered on the cinematic. The air smelled of wet earth and leaves, pungent, real, a sensory reminder that life was neither abstract nor distant. Here everything was immediate, every detail charged with significance. Then came the moment of revelation. He noticed the faint outline of a photograph clutched in the girl's small hand, partially obscured by her coat. It was a simple snapshot, nothing ornate, yet the implications were seismic. His eyes widened as recognition dawned. The child was not a stranger. She belonged to a life he had thought erased, a chapter buried beneath success and ambition. Memories surged unbidden, the laughter he had missed, the absence he had rationalized, the love he had forsaken. The photograph, small and fragile, had shattered the illusion of safety, exposing truths he had long denied to himself and the world. Emotion surged through him like a tidal wave. Regret, guilt, longing, and fear collided violently, leaving him breathless, unmoored. He felt the raw ache of lost time, of opportunities squandered, of emotional deserts he had traversed alone. And yet, within the chaos of feeling, there was clarity. The little girl, so delicate and small, had become a conduit for revelation, a guide through the labyrinth of his conscience. Her presence demanded acknowledgement, forced confrontation, and illuminated paths he had long avoided. The shadows shifted again, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw movement beyond the girl. A figure, adult, distant, observing. The sense of surveillance intensified, layering the encounter with both danger and urgency. He realized that the world outside this park was not passive. Forces beyond his awareness were moving, aligned or opposed to the truths now emerging. The tension spiraled, coiling around his chest, compressing him with the dual weight of external threat and internal reckoning. The girl remained still, unwavering, as though she knew the threads of this confrontation better than he did. Then the confrontation deepened. Memory after memory surfaced in sharp, cinematic flashes. Long nights of solitude, missed birthdays, boardroom victories that felt hollow, words left unsaid to people who mattered most, fleeting glimpses of tenderness abandoned in pursuit of control. Each recollection struck him with precision, a hammer of emotional intensity that left him staggering. The little girl's gaze held him in place, steady, almost commanding, as if insisting he witness the full measure of his life's consequences. He could not look away. He could not shield himself. The moment demanded total surrender. The darkness deepened further, and he became aware of his own breath, ragged, uneven, marking the passage of this climactic moment. Every instinct screamed for resolution, for clarity, yet the full truth remained partially veiled, teasing, tantalizing. The emotional crescendo pressed forward, building toward release. And in that silence, he felt the power of the little girl's presence, the paradox of fragility and strength, of innocence and insight, of challenge and compassion. She was no longer a mere child. She was the axis around which his understanding of himself pivoted, the catalyst for transformation he had resisted but desperately needed. The ultimate confrontation arrived with subtle precision. A hand, trembling slightly, reached for the photograph, And in that gesture, the culmination of weeks of tension crystallized. Every layer of secrecy, every suppressed emotion, every misstep and misjudgment of the past converged. He felt exposed, unshielded, naked in the most profound sense. The world outside could intrude all it wanted, the pressures, the surveillance, the judgments, but none of it equaled the intensity of this intimate reckoning. He was forced to confront the raw, undeniable reality of his life. The absences, the losses, the emotional neglect, and the consequences they had wrought. And yet, in the same instant, there was possibility. A path forward shimmered faintly amidst the ruins of his control. The little girl, through her unwavering gaze and fragile presence, offered a choice: surrender to despair or step into acknowledgement, empathy, and connection. The tension hit its peak, balancing on the edge of fear and hope, of devastation and redemption. He realized that transformation required both confrontation and courage. That truth demanded both recognition and acceptance. In that suspended moment, the past, present, and future converged, and the full weight of revelation fell upon him. The climax reached its emotional zenith as he took in the little girl fully, not as an intruder, not as a stranger, but as the embodiment of all that he had lost and all that might yet be regained. He felt tears sting his eyes, a long-suppressed vulnerability breaking free, raw, and unfiltered. The photograph, once a symbol of separation, became a bridge, a fragile yet unbreakable link between lives, between hearts, between what had been neglected and what could be nurtured. The silence around them was no longer oppressive. It became charged with possibility, a breathing space for the first steps toward repair. The park seemed to exhale with him, releasing the tension that had held it in thrall for weeks. Leaves rustled in a gentle cadence, the swings swayed softly, and the distant hum of the city faded into an unobtrusive background. The little girl, small and fragile, yet impossibly resilient, remained by his side, a living testament to the power of truth, confrontation, and emotional courage. The stakes, once so painfully high, had resolved into clarity. The climax had been reached, not through grand gestures or explosive action, but through the quiet, unyielding force of acknowledgement and emotional exposure. For the first time in years, he felt seen. Not superficially, not strategically, but truly in the way that stripped away all pretense, all artifice, all carefully constructed defenses. And within that visibility came both terror and liberation, a profound confrontation with self that demanded change. The little girl had orchestrated this reckoning without a word of explanation, relying solely on presence, observation, and the weight of what she carried silently within her own small frame. She had become the axis of transformation, the trigger for a reckoning that could not be postponed, the embodiment of both challenge and hope. The park had shifted once more, though the change was subtle, imperceptible to an outside observer. The shadows that had seemed to coil with menace now lay softened beneath the pale light of an emerging moon. The wind whispered through the trees with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the turbulence of the past days. It was as if the world itself recognized the transformation, granting space for reflection and renewal. The bench where he had spent so many tense hours no longer felt like a place of judgment, but a quiet witness to the unraveling of truths long suppressed. He sat there, head bowed, the photograph held loosely in his hands. Its edges were frayed, slightly curling from repeated handling, yet the image it contained radiated a significance that neither age nor wear could diminish. In it was a fragment of a life he had almost let slip away, a tangible reminder of connection, love, and responsibility. The weight of absence that had plagued him for decades now pressed differently, not as suffocating emptiness, but as a solemn invitation to repair, to embrace what remained salvageable. The little girl remained at his side, silent, steady, a constant presence that had guided him without command or imposition. Her small frame leaned slightly against the bench, a gesture of companionship and trust that spoke volumes in the absence of words. She was both observer and catalyst, witness and participant, embodying the paradox of fragility and strength. Through her, he had glimpsed not only the consequences of his actions, but the possibility of change. Her persistence, subtle yet unwavering, had pried open doors he had long sealed, allowing him to confront the complexity of his own life with honesty and courage. The first step, he realized, was acknowledgement. Not acknowledgement for appearances, not for the sake of social propriety or professional facades, but for the raw, unfiltered truth of his existence. He acknowledged the solitude he had imposed, the relationships neglected, the emotional debts accumulated over years of ambition and control. He acknowledged the longing that had been masked by success, the emptiness that had been disguised by meticulous schedules and public approval. And in this acknowledgement, he found an unexpected sense of liberation. The act of facing the truth reduced its power over him, transforming it from a source of guilt into a foundation for growth. The process of repair began in small, almost imperceptible ways. He returned to places he had avoided, reaching out to connections he had left dormant. Each attempt was tentative, a delicate dance between fear of rejection and the yearning for reconnection. Yet each gesture, no matter how small, carried profound significance. A phone call to a distant relative, an apology left unspoken for years, a quiet act of kindness toward a colleague. All these were threads weaving a tapestry of renewal. The photograph remained with him as a constant reminder, a symbol of both vulnerability and resilience, of the consequences of neglect and the power of acknowledgement. The little girl's role in this transformation was subtle yet undeniable. She became a bridge between isolation and connection, between fear and courage, between loss and reclamation. Her presence reminded him that change was not merely a personal endeavor, but a shared experience, one that required empathy, awareness, and the willingness to engage with the lives of others. She had entered his world quietly, gently, yet with a force that could not be ignored. Through her, he had learned that influence does not require dominance, that guidance does not necessitate authority, and that profound impact can arise from the simplest acts of presence and attentiveness. As the days passed, the park itself seemed transformed, reflecting the subtle shift in his own life. The shadows that once held menace now appeared protective. The wind that had stirred anxiety now whispered reassurance, and the rustling leaves carried an almost melodic cadence, a soundtrack for reflection and healing. He began to see the world with renewed clarity, perceiving the interconnections between people, actions, and consequences. The fragility of life, once a source of fear, became a source of wonder, emphasizing the preciousness of moments, relationships, and opportunities for redemption. In this transformed state, He also observed the long-term consequences of past neglect, not as punishment but as lessons. He recognized the ways his absence had affected others, the subtle ways decisions and inactions ripple outward, touching lives in unforeseen manners. There was pain in these realizations, certainly, yet also a profound impetus for change. Awareness, he discovered, was a form of agency. Understanding the past enabled him to act differently in the present. The mistakes that had once seemed irreparable now became guides for more mindful, compassionate engagement with the world around him. The little girl, for her part, remained a constant, a quiet lodestar guiding him through the terrain of emotional recovery. Her own presence hinted at complexities yet untold, a life shaped by resilience, observation, and insight beyond her years. He sensed that her guidance was not merely circumstantial, but intentional, shaped by experiences and understanding that mirrored, in miniature, the struggles he himself had faced. In recognizing this, he felt both gratitude and awe, acknowledging the remarkable power of human presence and the often overlooked capacity of the young and seemingly fragile to effect profound change. There were moments of stillness, moments when the past pressed against him like an uninvited guest. Memories surfaced unbidden, quiet dinners missed, birthdays unattended, opportunities for connection squandered. Each memory carried its own weight, yet he no longer recoiled from them. Instead, he faced them with measured attention, allowing each recollection to inform his understanding, shaping the decisions he would make moving forward. The park, with its familiar benches and whispering trees, became a sanctuary not of escape, but of engagement. A space where reflection and action coexisted, where vulnerability was met with possibility rather than judgment. Healing, he realized, was neither instantaneous nor linear. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, lapses into old patterns of avoidance. Yet the steady presence of the little girl, the reminders embedded in small gestures, and the clarity derived from confrontation allowed for resilience. Each day became an opportunity to practice empathy, to reconnect, to repair, to extend understanding not only to others but also to himself. Emotional growth, he discovered, required patience, courage, and sustained attention, qualities he had long undervalued in the pursuit of efficiency and control. Justice, in its quietest form, also emerged. Not through punishment or retribution, but through recognition and accountability. He acknowledged the lives touched by his absence, the ways privilege and power had insulated him from consequences, and the subtle shifts in behavior and attention allowed for redress. Each conscious action, no matter how minor, carried weight. By choosing engagement over avoidance, he exercised a form of moral and emotional justice, restoring balance in ways both tangible and ineffable. By the time the park had darkened fully, bathed in the gentle luminescence of streetlights and moonlight, a profound sense of transformation had taken root. He was no longer merely a figure of authority, isolated by success and ambition. He was a man engaged with his past, present, and future, aware of the fragility and resilience inherent in human experience. The little girl, small, unassuming, and yet immensely potent in influence, had catalyzed this transformation. Her presence had rendered him fully visible to himself, illuminating both the gaps and the possibilities within his life. As he stood to leave, the photograph still in hand, he cast a glance at her. There was a shared understanding between them, silent yet absolute. No words were necessary. The weight of everything unspoken carried clarity and resolution. The world, with its chaos, its shadows, and its uncertainties, remained outside the park. Yet within this space, a microcosm of possibility had been realized. He had been confronted, challenged, and ultimately transformed, not through confrontation with others, but through confrontation with himself, guided by the unexpected insight of a child. The final steps through the park were deliberate, measured, each movement imbued with the newfound awareness of connection, responsibility, and possibility. The leaves crunched softly beneath his shoes, a rhythm marking the transition from isolation to engagement, from fear to hope. Shadows receded, leaving space for clarity, reflection, and quiet empowerment. The path ahead, though uncertain, felt navigable, anchored by lessons learned, insights gained, and the enduring presence of someone who had shown, without words, the profound impact of empathy, observation, and courage. At the park's edge, he paused and looked back. The bench, the trees, the faint outlines of the swings, they all remained, but their meaning had shifted. No longer a backdrop for isolation, the space had become a canvas of revelation and possibility. And in that pause, he realized the truth that had eluded him for years. Life's weight is not in the solitude endured or the power exercised, but in the connections acknowledged, the responsibilities embraced, and the courage to face both past and present with honesty. The little girl remained a quiet sentinel in the distance, a small yet enduring force in his world. Her influence, subtle yet transformative, had revealed the possibilities that emerge when presence meets awareness, when empathy confronts avoidance, and when vulnerability is met with courage. He felt a deep, resonant gratitude, not merely for her actions, but for the awakening she had prompted within himself. She had borrowed nothing. Instead, she had lent him perspective, clarity, and the opportunity to reclaim a life previously abandoned to isolation. As he walked into the night, leaving the park behind, he carried more than the photograph. He carried the lessons of acknowledgement, the courage born from confrontation, and the clarity of emotional truth. The world outside awaited with its pressures, uncertainties, and challenges, yet he was equipped with a renewed sense of purpose, guided by the understanding that human connection, fragile, powerful, transformative, was both the anchor and the compass of a life fully lived. And in the quiet aftermath, a single question lingered, unspoken yet palpable. If such transformation could arrive through the quiet insistence of a child, what else, he wondered, remained possible in a world he had long believed unchangeable?